Something strange is happening to religion, not loudly, not with riots or revolutions, but quietly. Churches are still standing, rituals are still performed, the words are still being spoken. Yet fewer people actually believe them. This isn't a war against faith, it's something far more unsettling. Organized religion isn't being attacked, it's being outgrown. And most people inside it don't even realize it yet. Tonight, we're not asking if religion is dying, we're asking why it's fading without resistance, and what replaced it. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, the silence no one is talking about. Here's the first clue: something is wrong. When belief systems truly collapse, history teaches us to expect noise, public outrage, street-level conflict, fierce debates that split families and nations. That is what happens when people feel something precious is being taken from them. But that is not what is happening now. What we are witnessing instead is something far more unsettling: silence, a slow withdrawal, a collective turning away without protest or ceremony. People are not standing outside churches to argue. They are not writing manifestos or burning books. They are simply not showing up anymore. And that difference matters more than it seems. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a verdict. When people stop arguing, it means the argument no longer feels worth having. When they stop trying to convince, it means the belief no longer feels central to their identity. For centuries, religion lived at the core of daily life. It shaped time, morality, family structure, fear, hope, and belonging. Leaving it once meant social death, exile, shame. Now, leaving often means nothing happens at all. No lightning strikes, no collapse of meaning. Life just continues, and that quiet continuity is deeply threatening to institutions built on necessity. What makes this silence even more dangerous is how invisible it is. Attendance drops quietly. Rituals thin out gradually. Conviction fades long before tradition does. From the outside, everything looks stable. Buildings remain, calendars stay full, words are still repeated. But internally, something essential has drained away. Belief is no longer assumed. It is optional. An optional belief rarely survives long. Institutions are designed to fight enemies, not indifference. Opposition creates energy. Criticism sharpens identity. Silence does neither. It simply erodes relevance. And once relevance fades, power follows. This is not a collapse you hear. It is a collapse you notice only in hindsight, when you realize an entire generation stopped caring without asking permission. And once that happens, there is no dramatic moment to point to, no single event to blame, just a quiet absence where certainty used to live, belief used to answer real questions. For most of human history, religion was not a lifestyle choice or a private identity. It was a tool for survival. When the world was unpredictable and dangerous, belief filled the gaps that knowledge could not. Death arrived suddenly. Disease struck without warning. Nature felt alive, hostile, and personal. Religion stepped into that chaos and offered answers that calmed the nervous system. It told people why things happened, even when those explanations could not be tested, and that alone made life bearable. When lightning split the sky, it was not random. Someone was watching. When crops failed, it was not meaningless. A lesson was being taught. When a child died, the pain had a purpose, even if no one could explain it clearly. These beliefs were not naive, they were adaptive. They gave humans a sense of control in a world that offered none. Religion did not need to be true in a scientific sense. It needed to be emotionally convincing, and for thousands of years, it was. But something profound changed. Slowly, and then all at once, explanations improved. Patterns became predictable. Causes became traceable. Storms stopped being messages and became systems. Illness stopped being punishment and became biology. Death stopped being a mystery, administered by divine will, and became a process we could observe, study, and sometimes delay. And with every gap that knowledge closed, belief lost another function. Today, when the sky darkens, we do not search our conscience. We check a forecast. When someone gets sick, we do not ask what sin caused it. We ask what treatment works. This shift may seem practical, but psychologically, it is revolutionary. Religion once provided answers when none existed. Now answers exist without religion. And belief systems that are built on explaining the unknown face a brutal choice when the unknown shrinks. They must evolve into something deeper, more symbolic, more psychological. Or they quietly lose ground to systems that explain reality better. Many institutions chose preservation over transformation. They kept the language, the rituals, the certainty, while the world moved on. And when a belief system stops solving real problems, people do not rebel against it. They simply stop needing it. Authority lost its spell. For most of history, religious authority did not need to persuade, it only needed to speak. If something was written in sacred text, it carried weight by default. If it was preached from a pulpit, it was accepted as truth. Questioning was not curiosity, it was disobedience. And obedience was not framed as submission to people, but as loyalty to something eternal. That framing gave religious authority immense power. It positioned leaders not as interpreters, but as gatekeepers of reality itself. What made that authority so effective was isolation. Information moved slowly. Texts were rare. Education was limited. If you wanted answers, you went to the institution that claimed to have them. There were no alternatives to compare, no parallel narratives to test against. Authority thrived in that closed system. It did not have to be perfect. It just had to be unchallenged. That environment no longer exists. Today, authority competes with access. A single sermon can be paused, replayed, searched, and cross-referenced in real time. A teenager with a phone can trace a quote back to its historical context in seconds. Contradictions that once stayed buried for centuries now surface instantly. Stories once presented as timeless truths are examined as products of specific cultures, power structures, and political needs. And when people begin to see how doctrines evolved, how rules shifted, how interpretations changed to serve those in control, something breaks, not explosively, quietly. The voice that once sounded absolute begins to sound human, fallible, motivated, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic. Once that realization sets in, authority loses its mystique. It becomes one perspective among many, not the final word. The crucial part is this: authority can survive disagreement. It cannot survive demystification. Once you see the machinery behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it. And obedience that once came from awe must now be justified rationally. Most institutions were never built for that transition. So while belief continues to weaken, the deeper fracture forms beneath the surface. Because when authority loses its spell, everything that depends on it begins to tremble. Morality escaped the building. Here is a quiet revolution that rarely makes headlines, yet changes everything. For centuries, religion positioned itself as the source of morality. It did not just guide behavior. It defined what good and evil were supposed to mean. To be moral was to be obedient. To question was to risk falling outside the circle of righteousness. Morality lived inside the building, guarded by doctrine, tradition, and authority. That relationship has reversed. Today, people do not automatically absorb morality from religion. They measure religion against their moral instincts instead. They listen, and then they evaluate. They ask questions that once would have been unthinkable. Why does compassion seem to have boundaries? Why is love offered freely to some, but withheld from others? Why is doubt treated as a threat rather than a natural part of being human? These questions do not come from rebellion. They come from moral development. As societies become more interconnected, people are exposed to different cultures, stories, and perspectives. Empathy expands. Ethical reasoning deepens. Suffering becomes visible beyond borders. And as this happens, moral intuition evolves faster than rigid doctrine ever could. When religious teachings fail to reflect that evolution, institutions begin to feel misaligned. Not cruel, not malicious, just behind the curve of human understanding. Rules that once felt protective start to feel restrictive. Judgments that once felt righteous start to feel arbitrary. And when that shift happens, people stop asking religion what is right. They ask whether religion itself is right. This is the moment morality leaves the building. Ethics no longer need permission. Compassion no longer requires scripture. Right and wrong are debated in the open, shaped by lived experience rather than inherited rules. And once morality operates independently, religious walls lose their function. They no longer contain truth. They merely house tradition. When that happens, something profound changes. Religion stops being a moral compass and becomes one option among many. And in that vacuum, something else begins to take its place. Meaning didn't disappear. It moved. Meaning never vanished from human life. It simply changed address. Humans did not become empty or directionless. When traditional belief loosened its grip, they became more inward-facing. Instead of asking institutions to tell them why they exist, people began asking themselves. And that shift, subtle as it seems, rewired the entire relationship between individuals and belief systems. For a long time, meaning was something you received. It was handed down through stories, commandments, and inherited purpose. Your role was to accept it, not shape it. But modern life exposed a problem with that arrangement. Prescribed meaning often failed to match lived experience. People followed the rules and still suffered. They believed the stories and still felt lost. That dissonance forced a new question to surface. Not what must I believe, but what actually helps me live. So, meaning migrated. It moved into creativity, where people express what words cannot hold. It moved into relationships, where connection replaces cosmic certainty. It moved into psychology, where inner conflict is explored instead of spiritualized. Self-understanding became a form of salvation, not from sin, but from confusion. This shift also changed how people relate to suffering. Pain is no longer automatically framed as a test, a punishment, or a lesson assigned from above. It is examined, felt, processed. People ask what it reveals about their needs, their boundaries, their past. Doubt is no longer treated as a moral failure. It is treated as data, a signal that something needs to be understood more deeply. When meaning becomes personal rather than imposed, institutions lose their monopoly overnight. They no longer define purpose. They compete with it. And competition is something belief systems built on authority were never designed to face. But the most dangerous change is not emotional fulfillment. It is psychological autonomy. When people realize they can generate meaning without permission, control mechanisms weaken. Because a person who understands their own mind is far harder to rule through fear, guilt, or promise, and that realization quietly reshapes everything that follows. Fear stopped working. Organized religion has always relied on one psychological lever more than any other: fear. Not crude fear alone, but refined, moralized fear. Fear framed as care, fear presented as protection. The fear of hell, of being cast out, of making a wrong choice that echoes into eternity. For centuries, this fear shaped behavior more reliably than any law ever could. It kept people compliant not because they were watched, but because they believed the consequences were unavoidable. Fear works best when it feels absolute, when there is no appeal process, no second opinion. If the threat is eternal, hesitation becomes dangerous, doubt becomes risky, questioning becomes a moral gamble. That is how fear maintains its grip. It does not need constant enforcement. It lives inside the mind. But fear has a weakness. It only functions while the threat feels real. The moment someone suspects the punishment may be symbolic, exaggerated, or entirely imagined, the structure begins to fail. And that moment is happening more often now. Quietly, individually. A person misses a service, nothing happens. They question a teaching, nothing happens. They step away entirely. Still, nothing happens. That experience is destabilizing in the most irreversible way, not because it proves anything metaphysical, but because it proves something psychological. The rules were optional, the danger was conditional. The fear was internal. And once that realization takes hold, fear loses its authority permanently. What makes this shift unstoppable is how it spreads. Not through sermons or debates, but through observation. People watch others leave and survive. They see former believers living full, ethical, meaningful lives. The catastrophic outcomes they were warned about never arrive, and fear, once exposed as hollow, cannot be reinstalled. Entire generations grow up seeing religion not as a shield against terror, but as a source of it. And when fear stops working, compliance collapses. Quietly, completely. Ritual without belief is just performance. Many people still walk into religious buildings. The doors are not locked. The rituals continue. The calendars remain full. From the outside, it can look like nothing has changed. But inside, something crucial is missing. Presence. People attend, but they do not inhabit the space. Their bodies are there, yet their inner world is elsewhere. They are not submitting their lives to belief. They are honoring a moment. Weddings bring them back. Funerals too. Holidays marked by memory rather than conviction. These moments are less about faith and more about continuity, about marking time, about belonging to a story that once mattered deeply to their families. Religion becomes a backdrop, not a guide, a setting, not a source. When belief fades, ritual does not disappear immediately. It transforms. It becomes performance. Familiar words are spoken without urgency. Gestures are repeated without inner agreement. The experience feels warm, even comforting, but strangely empty, like revisiting a childhood home after everyone has moved out. The structure stands, but the life has left. This is where institutions begin to struggle. They were built to transmit belief, not nostalgia. Tradition can preserve form, but it cannot generate conviction. And without conviction, rituals lose their power to shape behavior, identity, or sacrifice. They become symbolic gestures, disconnected from daily life. Once religion shifts from truth to culture, its role changes permanently. It stops telling people how to live and starts reminding them how people used to live. That might sustain it for a while, but it also sets a limit. Cultures evolve, memories fade. Each generation feels less attached to rituals that no longer reflect their inner reality. And this is the danger institutions rarely acknowledge. You cannot inherit belief. You can only inherit performance, and performance without belief has an expiration date. It survives until people stop pretending. And that brings us to the final twist. This isn't the death of spirituality. What we are witnessing is often misnamed. This is not the death of spirituality. It is the unbinding of it. Organized religion may be fading, but the human impulse toward depth, wonder, and transcendence is more visible than ever. It has simply slipped its old containers. It no longer asks for permission. It no longer wears a single uniform. Spirituality now appears in places that would have once seemed secular or even threatening. In meditation apps downloaded by millions. In philosophy, podcasts that ask ancient questions with modern language. In psychology, where people explore the inner world with honesty rather than doctrine. In quiet moments of self-inquiry, where meaning is felt rather than declared. People did not stop asking the big questions. Why am I here? How should I live? What matters when everything else falls away? Those questions never disappeared. What disappeared was the patience for answers that felt too small, too rigid, or too disconnected from lived experience. Certainty lost its appeal. Exploration replaced it. This shift changes how truth is approached. Instead of being delivered from above, it is discovered through experience. Instead of being defended, it is tested. Spirituality becomes something lived, not something claimed. It is less about belonging to a group and more about understanding the self, less about heaven later and more about clarity now. History often misreads these transitions. It looks for collapse where there is transformation. It assumes loss where there is redistribution. Organized religion is losing influence not because people became shallow, but because they became more psychologically sophisticated. They want frameworks that can hold complexity, contradiction, and doubt without punishment. That is what this moment represents, not a rejection of meaning, but a refusal to shrink it. Spirituality did not vanish, it spread. And that quiet expansion, far from being a failure of faith, may be the most enduring legacy of all. Organized religion isn't dying because people became immoral, or rebellious, or lost. It's fading because humans matured psychologically, because authority weakened, fear lost power, and meaning became personal. This isn't the collapse of faith, it's the evolution of it. The real question isn't whether religion survives, it's whether truth survives without needing permission. So keep questioning, keep thinking, and if you value truth over comfort, subscribe.